Hello, welcome to the April 14th, 2026 Club Cubase livestream. My name is Greg Undo, and I'm the host of the livestream today. If you have not attended a live stream before, how it works is you can ask questions in the live chat field or send questions in advance by emailing clubcubase@steinberg.de. When asking questions, realizing my ability to answer questions in a real-time manner may not be possible after a while because of the number of questions coming in. We will go through all the questions in order chronologically as asked. So if you don't see an immediate response to your question, if we could avoid asking the same questions over and over again, that would be appreciated. We should have an index of all of the topics covered in today's live stream pinned to the top of the comments field several hours after the live stream ends. So you could immediately go to particular sections to see a response to questions, and we've answered over 44,000 questions. And if you wanted to search for previous topics that have been covered in other live streams, you could go to CubaseIndex.com, and we want to thank Jan from Stockholm, who's on as Cubase Index, I believe. We want to thank him for creating that website. We also have two people that serve as moderators. We have Jazz Dude and Agent K. They're not Steinberg employees. They just do this to make it a better community experience, and we want to express our gratitude to them. We will also give it an extra expression of gratitude for Jazz Dude for his efforts with the unofficial Cubase Nation Discord, which is a wonderful resource of information for the Steinberg community. So if you're looking for links, tutorials, templates, presets, lots of, really pertinent, relevant, great information that's really, again, beneficial to the Steinberg user. Once again, my name is Greg Undo. I work for Yamaha Corporation of America, and I primarily focus on Steinberg products, and I am the host of the live stream today. If you have, and if you are attending live or watching afterwards, please feel free to introduce yourself and tell us where you are from. And with that, we will go ahead and get started. All right, so we see Class joining from Malmo, Sweden. Great to see you on again. Tim K joining from Zeist in the Netherlands. His cat Buddy is waving a paw hello to my cat Steven, Stella, and other pets that are nearby, and he's ready to learn. We see Jan is Cubase Index on. Always great to see Jazz Dude with his perfect attendance record. We have VS Terra Nova joining from Amsterdam. We have Briley Music joining, saying hi to everyone. We have Peter Bata joining from Montreal. Great to see you on, Peter. We have TrackQuest Music, wants people to hit the like button. All right, we have Calote joining from Portugal. Thanks for being part of the community, along with Rude Pass from Holland. We have Soren in Sweden, John Barry from the English Riviera. Sounds like a great place to be. All right, we see Randy Lee joining from Texas, Soul Sound Official. All right, we have Beverly Beatty joining from Vancouver. Thanks for being on line with us. All right, we have Vince joining as Flyv from Winnipeg. All right, so we have Fanaton asks, hi Greg, I have a problem using Vocalign 6 Pro, gives me ghost tails, even got Cubase completely frozen. Is there any Cubase settings that I have to apply to fix this issue? I have Cubase Pro 15. So I don't have a Vocalign license, so I've never really worked with it. Most of the time it's going to work as an ARA extension. So if we were to do something as like an ARA extension, we could just kind of come over. So let's say if we have this and we want to run something as an AR extension. So, you know, an AR extension, ARA extension differs than a plugin because it allows you to kind of go into a different editing environment. So some tools that allow you to do that. So when we come over to our track, we'll see extension. So we could just come over here and say, okay, I want to launch this in spectral layers, and then we launch. So I'm not sure if make sure you're running it as a ARA extension. So now, as soon as we have this particular track set up for spectral layers, so now when I double click, I'm inside of this particular editing environment. So make sure that you're running it as an ARA extension. So here we could do your editing within, you know, if you're running Vocalign as an ARA extension, or if you're running it, you know, internally, like in its own plugin interface. So this should work. So, but if you're having, so when it says it gives you ghost tails, you know, so once I'm doing editing here, I'm doing this inside of spectral layers or inside the editor for the particular environment. So you could also just come over here and, you know, choose extensions directly from the info line. So generally that's going to be within, you know, whatever that extension is doing. So it could be more directly, you know, with the Vocalign, you know, portion of the editing, because, you know, once you're in Vocalign, all that processing and editing tasks are being handled by Vocalign via the extension. So let me know if you have, if you're running it via an extension. And again, unfortunately, I don't have a license that I've, you know, because we have kind of our own audio alignment inside of Cubase. So personally, I have never really sought out a license for Vocalign, but I don't have one. Maybe if other people could chime in with if you're running Vocalign, if you've had issues with it or not. All right, next question from TrackQuest Music. Hi, Greg. Before folder group setup, always had a hard time exporting stems with easy understanding and organizing. Now so easy, effects tracks and everything in between. So, yeah, it's simplified the workflow for a lot of people. All right, so TrackQuest Music asks, could you explain some of the unique naming schemes through on a multiple stem output? Thanks. All right, so let's say if I wanted to do like a batch export to create stems. So if we come over here, we go to our export audio mixdown and we go to multiple, and once we do this, we have our naming convention. So let's say, okay, I want to name this, you know, if we were doing like a stereo mix down, the name of this project is a live stream start. All right, but let's say I wanted to come over here. We could also click on naming schemes. So here, when we do a batch export, I could have the channel name. So let's say I look at the channel names here. So I have chord track, sound, Rhodes, synth bass, acoustic agent. So when we export the files, they would automatically include the particular name of the track that we are exporting. So once we do that, now we could also come over here and say, you know, what channel type do we want? And we could just kind of drag these different items down. So we can say, okay, I want my channel name. I want the project name. So this project is called Live Stream Start. So this way it would be a file named Rhodes _ live stream start, and you could, or dash live stream start. And we could see kind of a preview that goes on here. We could also come over and add what we call a counter. So as we do this, if we wanted to add numeric counters, we could also add free text. So let's say we have free text, and once we have free text here, we could double click. So let's say we want to put today's date on the file. So Now when we export based on these particular naming schemes that we have, we see, okay, in addition to the channel name, it'll be the name of the project, the counter, and today's date. And we could also just put another free text, and let's say at this point, we want this to, be, so when we come over here, I'll drop it here. So let's say we're going to call this one our final export. So now we could just kind of come over here, and all of these extensions will be included on the particular exported file. So the name of the file will have all of these conditions. So that way we could easily just, differentiate between different stems and add names, so that someone down who's maybe importing all the files, to make it harder for them to mess up for you. So, and again, to access the naming schemes, you could just come right over here. You see this little in the name, you'll see this little settings cogwheel. Open that up, and then you could have different presets for naming schemes as well. So let me know if that's helpful for you. All right, Jazz Dude sending a link to the Cubase 15 sales promotion. It's currently going on, I believe 30% off until maybe April 28th. See Jan from Cubase Index giving kudos to Jazz Dude for the unofficial Cubase Nation Discord. We have Sergey Moskali, maybe it's Moskali or Moskali UK, joining from Sacramento. We have Nico Thomason from Finland. Thanks for being part of it today. All right, John Barry VU says, evening Greg, having an issue with Project Logical Editor preset toggle EQ bypass on selected track when using a track in a new group folders, find outside of folder. Yeah, so we kind of did this last week, so it doesn't seem that the folder track in the Project Logical Editor responds to the selected track command in the Project Logical Editor. So I passed that on to Steinberg so they're aware of it, but it currently doesn't seem to be functioning. All right, and we see from Alex Morgan, says, hi, great question about the new routing folders in the Project Logical Editor. You can command it to connect to certain outputs, which I use a lot, but can't seem to do these for the new plugin folders. Any help? So I think that the folders with the group tracks, we tried this on the last live stream, and as I just mentioned, it doesn't seem to be able to do it to the selected. I can change all of the particular Project Logical. I could change all the folder tracks, but not a selected one. And I think that we need to set it to the group track, but we can't differentiate a selected folder track with group in the Project Logical Editor. All right. So we see Razel's Mini joining from Denmark. We have Don from Essex in the UK. All right, so we see Soul Sound Official says somebody didn't play much when he was a kid. All right. So Stella, Mark Rabin's dog, is checking in and letting us know that Mark is soldering wood. And a big woof. Everyone give a big woof to Stella, Mark's dog. All right, so we see Benny from Sweden. right, so we see from John Barry VU says same applies for bypass inserts and bypass sends. So I know that Steinberg had, I think, acknowledged change. So let's say if I come here and I want to bypass inserts. So let's say if I have a track with a lot of inserts. So I think that there might be different behavior if you trigger it from a keyboard shortcut versus a from the Project Logical Editor, but let's give it a shot. So here, and let's see if it is on the selected track only. So I'll duplicate this particular track. And I'll add the caveat of property is set to is selected. So we should see this one bypass and this one not, if it's working correctly. So it seems like the channel inserts, so you may have to, see if it actually adjusts for you if you trigger it from within the Project Logical Editor versus a keyboard shortcut. All right, so Briley Music is also checking in from Finland. Thanks for letting us know. All right, Michael Teams has joined us from Weatherford, Texas, so the virtual ice cream distribution should begin. And John Costigan is sending thanks to me and everyone in the Hangout supply chain. John Barry says, cheers, Greg. Sorry, missed last week. No problems. We're just glad you're here today. All right, Non-Delusional is watching from Newport, Rhode Island. All right. Michael Teams granted Jazz Dude 1 gallon of chocolate chip ice cream. All right, we see Rick from Bratman Studio, joining from Uptown Whittier, California, on a beautiful Southern California day. All right, Beverly Beatty just says, Greg, can you demonstrate the MIDI inserts Chorder, please? Okay, so it's a MIDI plugin, so let's come over here. Let's go to my MIDI inserts. All right, so let's say I have a Rhodes patch. Let me just turn down. Okay, so now what we want to do is go to the Chorder plugin. So this is, check out some of the presets are quite nice. So let's say if I wanted to come over here. So what you could do is have different chords that will be triggered by different MIDI notes. So let's say, okay, I want to come over here. Let's go to, guitar 7. So it allows you really to just kind of switch and basically to trigger chords. So if you want it, you couldn't play particular chords. Then you could switch it to only be in one particular octave of your MIDI, or if you wanted to be able to play it on all keys, or if you want to come over here and just So this is basically going to allow you to, so come over here and just trigger chords. So you can think of this as probably a precursor to the chord pads. So probably a lot of people when using, and if you wanted to edit the chords that are on, you could now just come over here, reset the chords. But this is kind of, think of it as a precursor probably to the chord pads. So probably more people, kind of like the beat designer is a precursor, kind of the first generation of what we see in the pattern editor. The Chorder is probably the first generation of what evolved into the chord pads themselves here. All right, Rick is wondering how Mark Raven is soldering wood or soldiering wood. So typos get everyone. All right, Mark Raven is saying his dog Stella loves the Groove Agent 6 shaker kit because it sounds like it's dog treats. All right, Beverly Beatty's giving a big woof to Stella, Mark Raven's dog. All right, reading through comments. We have Uno Memento joining from Finland. You see Alex from Mojave Desert on, Mojave, Arizona. All right, we have Lawrence Koch checking in from Rhode Island. Great to see you on a Tuesday live stream. We usually see you on Fridays. All right, so we see Matt Elston on. All right, and we see Gareth on from Bilbao, Spain. All right, Tim Weinheimer says, when using the Stream Deck keys on the Yamaha CC1, can you give me a brief example how to set up a custom key? Try to go on YouTube to find it, but I can't find a specific video. All right, so let me get mine connected here. Bear with me a minute, I'll get it plugged in. All right, so say we have the control center going on. So I think really what you do is maybe just go to like the Stream Deck. Software, let me see if it's, so if we go to configure Stream Deck, and now when I come over here, I can see this is my Stream Deck for the CC1. So I could switch between different Stream Deck units, but I also have the CC1 here. So at this point, I would just say, okay, I want this to be a hotkey, so we could now just come over here and say, okay, we want this to be a hotkey switch. And then, you know, being that, and now we could just kind of drag over like the Stream Deck controls. So let me just come over here to my system. Let's see if we can. And you could have like a free MIDI plugin. So if you wanted to drag and drop different note on messages, and then that note message, you could have this trigger something in the MIDI remote. So I believe that you could now just kind of send this directly over to the CC1. So if you wanted to, you know, put MIDI messages, there is a MIDI, you may have to set up, you know, different, like a MIDI loopback for that to work. But when you kind of come over here, you could just choose to have a hotkey switch and say, okay, this is the key that I want to do. And then we could just call this select all. And you could change the graphics directly here on the Stream Deck software. So maybe try using the Stream Deck software for it. And I think you could configure it there. Great. All right, so we see Bratman Studio says, hey, Greg, I read The Usual Suspects has updated Nord Virtual Synth. Have you seen it yet? So I got the Roland, I got the JE8086 or whatever, the Roland one, but I haven't done the Nord one, so I wasn't sure if Nord had put the ROM out officially. So if the ROM isn't out, I don't want to really do it, but... All right, so we have Morris Fraser joining from Edinburgh, Scotland. Thanks for being online with us. We have Jorge joining from Mexico City. It says, can we have subgroups in folders, folder tracks? All right, so let's say I have all of my drums here. My drums are now in a folder track. So if I wanted to come over here and take my kick drums and let's add a group to that. All right, so now if we solo our group, the group is now feeding. So let's say as we play, so this is my overall multi folder, and then I have a subgroup in here. So let's say I will just do my routing via send. So now we have our subgroup here. And we could route this group so this is being routed out to the multi-drum, or if you wanted to route it out to stereo out for so you could have different subgroups within the folders as well. Kara says you can add folders into folders quicker than a new iPhone leak. All right, great to see Gareth on. He's saying evening MIDI master, Greg. All right. All right, so Link of Time G asks, I had a question. Is there a way to change the tuning of a whole project I've been trying to figure out, but I have no dice outside of changing it in the VSTs? So let's say we have a project that's both, audio and MIDI. So let's say if we come over, all right, so let's say we have, so what I could do, if you need to change it by by semitones, we could add a transpose track. So right click. So let's say when it comes right here, I want it to go up a major second. So it's gonna now modulate when it gets to that point. And then you could have tracks that are drums, not. So we get locked. So let's say I want to take my groove agent track here and we'll lock it. So now going to a transpose track. I should have told you you were out of tune. Whatever you did, that was okay. Up until now, that was okay. So I just wanted to. Suddenly it's Beatles or Stones. Something about that just sounds so wrong. So as we were doing this, I got to choose what's mine and what's yours. This track is locked. Let me lock the drums here. Sorry about that. Where I have my groove agent. Okay, so I'm gonna lock my groove agent track, and now when I come over here, you're asking Beatles or Stones. Something who's what's mine and what's yours. Now you're asking Beatles or Stones. Something about that just sounds so wrong. What is too late to start? Take the records that you like. Please stop asking Beatles or Stones. And back to our original key. Just leave it alone. So when I played Hey Jude, just come right here and go add a transpose track. And if you want the audio to, if it's only audio, what you could do with the audio is, let's say, clear my throat. If you want to just take the audio, you could select all your audio bits here. So let's say we're doing this. I should have told you you were out of tune. Whatever you did. And then you could just come here to transpose, and there's a fine tune here. So let's say that was okay. We're going to transpose down 22 cents or 8 cents to be aligned with the Cosmos. Something about that just sounds so wrong. So you could do that, or just again. Just come here and say, okay, we want to go down -1 to modulate. Don't know the words. You're scratching the vinyl. Go back to the original keys. So you could try to transpose track if you want everything to be transposed, including, including your MIDI. But for some stuff, like if you have Groove Agent here, you may want to. you could just come over here to the global transpose and choose for it to be independent. So now as we come here, the drums should stay the same. The MIDI drums won't transpose. And now we want to go back to our original key right here. Back to our original. So let me know if that's helpful for you. Okay, read through comments here. Kara says, great to hear your world peace causing calm voice again, Greg. It's great to see you on. Hope you're well. And we got Pablo on as well. So wonderful to have all of Hot Mess on. Everyone's always happy when Pablo is on. And he's asking for 1 trillion scoops of ice cream. All right, so you see from John Barry, says, hi Greg, trying container type track in action, target track operation sends bypass, and the enable and disable work on folder group tracks, but not the toggle, which still sits outside of folder. Yeah, I know Steinberg's aware of some of the changes, so. All right, Pablo's sending trivia. It says, what is Greg's favorite preset for Groove Agent? And it's Forget the Past. So that's one I usually pull up for acoustic agents, and usually urban ballads for beat agents. So link of Time G says, does that work taking the whole project from 440 hertz to 432 hertz? Also didn't even think to try the transpose. So this would do in semitones if you wanted all of the audio in the project here. So let's say if I select, all of the audio in this particular project. So we could actually I'll show it here just on the 2 guitar parts. So if we just select all of the audio events, I could go to my fine tune and knock it down, like one of the tracks down -8 cents. So even if I wanted to select all of the audio events, and I wanted this to be from like 440 tuning to 432. So if I want to go down farther in the drums or in the vocal. So now we're almost a quarter tone flat. And we go down to 50 up or 50 down, 49 down. So now we're half a tone flat. But if you go to the fine tune, you could just type in -8. Or if you want it to be. Something about that just sounds so wrong. So now that's half a tone up. So for all of your selected events, So if I want to be 0.
Please stop asking Beatles or Stones.
So if you wanted to go kind of mimic 432 tuning, you could select all the audio. For MIDI, you would have to go into the instruments. The instruments themselves would have to support that. But if you come over to most of your instruments, like the Steinberg instruments here, so let's say, okay, if I go to Howling and Sonic, where we have a lot of these instruments, we could set your tuning here from 440 to 432, and that way your MIDI will be in tune if you tune the guitar or piano to 432 and you're using that as the basis for the foundation of your tuning. So okay. All right. So Rick from Bratman Studios asking if I have a drum track in 4/4 and I need to convert it to 7/4 or 7/8 and it's audio, not MIDI, what would be the best way to change? Time warp or what? Okay, so let's say we'll jump back to this. We're going to have like a 4/4 drum loop here. Okay, so let's say we have very typical 4/4 drum loop here. All right, so if I wanted to make that into 7/4, what you could do is just come over here and say, okay, I will say bounce selection. And let's see if I... All right, so say we have two measures of 4/4 here. So if I want, I could just roll this back, and if we want it to be in 7/4, so let's come over to change my time signature here to 7/4. All right, so now as we listen to our drum loop, now you could also conversely kind of come over here and just chop out, let's say, the fourth beat of this measure. So let's say I want to come here, and if I hit Command Shift X, we could also have kind of a 7/4. So you could easily kind of just cut out a particular beat and, from two measures of 4/4 drum loop, just randomly cut out a beat, and then you could turn that into a 7/4 or a 7/8, depending on how you're counting what particular note is getting the pulse of the beat. So give that a try, and but you could just kind of chop up the audio and have 7 different pulses if you wanted to. and be creative that way. Okay. Okay, so we see Illy Wineves. Why is my sustain pedal affecting the panning on my VSTs? All right, so probably your sustain pedal, maybe your MIDI controller is probably set up as like a MIDI remote controller. Okay, so when you come over here, your MIDI remote is basically sending MIDI messages so that when you move a parameter on your remote, that this is sending MIDI messages, and these MIDI messages, so we move this fader, these faders are sending MIDI messages to parameters in the program. So the language is going to be MIDI. So probably if you have a controller setup, if you come over here to your studio setup and we go to MIDI port setup, like let's say if I wanted to come over here, we can say, okay, maybe I don't want my, you'll probably see a little column here that says in all MIDI inputs. All right, so probably one of the MIDI devices that you have, one of your MIDI controllers that you're using for remote control is, as soon as you do that, with the sustain message is probably used for panning. So try whatever port you have that's being routed to the remote control. So if you have a MIDI controller like a keyboard, you may have one port that's for the keyboard and one that's for the particular like remote control functionality. So when you go to the remote control functionality, come over here and make sure that the port that's for the remote control is unchecked for the in all MIDI inputs. And again, this is going to be studio menu to studio setup and under MIDI to MIDI port setup. And you could just simply make sure that, you know, if you uncheck in all MIDI inputs, that message that is being sent from the controller that's meant to adjust the panning is now doing the panning and the sustain pedal for your particular information. So check like your either a generic remote mapping, or if you have a Mackie control, make sure that that port there when you go to your MIDI port setup is set to in all MIDI inputs is unchecked directly there. And that'll probably fix it for you. All right, so a question from Pablo. It says, if I have a mastering session at 48K, can I export it in 44.1 and MP3, for example, at the same time? So, yeah. Let's come over here. Let's open up Wavelab 13. Okay, so if we come over to, you know, so even if we come over here, I think if we just go to, your export. So here we can say, okay, you have the option, let me just, when you go to render, to do a multi-render. So here at this point, you could say, okay, I want to do this as, a wave file, and then you have different factory presets. So let's say, okay, I want this to be an MP3, let's say Fraunhofer at 320K. So I could do that. And then, once you come over here, you could also choose, a different setting simultaneously. So at this point, we could say, okay, I want to do the whole montage. So you could actually just kind of create entire, multi presets right here. Just make sure that you go to multi, and then you can say, okay, we're going to have this, and we want to do the whole montage. And you could actually save these as like different presets as well. So you could now just come over here and say, okay, we want to do our MP3, we want to do our audio montage as, choose a different one. So you can see that you have, here's Wave 16 plus MP3. So you could just have your different formats and choose different sample rates and everything right there. So once you go, and you could also access this from the render. So let's say if we're here and we go, okay, I want to go to my render, and you could also just choose kind of your multi render settings right there. So yeah, you could definitely do that right there, Pablo. All right, so we have a question from Wismo74. It says, hi Greg, I've got a question regarding render in place. I found I can't render in place a Yamaha Modi X. I assume it's because it's an external device. Can you show which way I can do something? So generally when you do an export, a render in place, the data that's in the program will automatically, will render it in place because the sound is being generated by a software plugin. All right. Now, if it's an external keyboard, the sound has to be generated. So we send the MIDI information out to the device, and then that device generates the sound. Now, what you could do in Cubase is come over here to your audio connections, and you need to have like an available input or output or available inputs on your audio interface. So we could basically kind of use your audio interface like a mixer. So let's say you have a 4-in, 4-out audio interface. You could take, and you have microphones on inputs 1 and 2. So let's say a microphone and a guitar processor on inputs 1 and 2. Inputs 3 and 4, we could come over here and have an external instrument. So if we say, okay, I want to come over here, let's add an external instrument. We'll give it a name. So we'll say, okay, Modi X. All right, and we're going to have one stereo return, so one stereo output. We go to the Modi X, and what we want to do is tell it where it's connected in our audio interface. Now, as we have the MIDI track, we would now come over here when we go to add an instrument track. We could just come over here and say, okay, we want to add, let's say, our Modi X. And now MIDI will be sent out to the Modi X. The audio out of the Modi X is coming in to the input that we've defined here. So the input, so now MIDI that's sent to a virtual instrument that's configured as an external instrument, now you could render. And when you render, since the sound is being generated from the external device, when you do a render in place, it will do it in real time because it has to play, send the MIDI out, that MIDI tone is generated in the particular instrument. And from that instrument, it's now captured directly into Cubase. Now, an easy way to do this also is once you have everything connected, if you don't have the luxury of a lot of additional inputs or you don't have enough inputs in your audio interface, you could just play, hit play. take the outputs from your MODI X, feed it into your audio interface, and add a stereo audio track and record the audio. But, so since the sound is outside of Cubase, you'd have to record it as audio or configure it as an external instrument. So configuring it as an external instrument will do the render in place, but you have to have the inputs on your audio interface. And that's kind of like, some of the huge workflow enhancements that working with virtual instruments offers. We obviously know that there's a need for external instruments, and that's why we have the ability to route the external instruments. But otherwise, there's no way of that Cubase ever hears a sound unless it's connected back to your particular audio interface. So let me know if that makes sense. Okay. All right, so we see from Soren, says, Greg, I'm fixing a problem I found in a song I made in 2023. Had it loaded into Cubase 15 Pro and a couple of VST instruments, makes sound, and creates TP plus 5. If I open the same project in Cubase 12 Pro, the instruments don't make sounds, and it is TP minus 4. Is the VSTs entirely to blame for that happening? So I'm not sure what TP plus 5 or TP minus 4 means, Soren. Maybe if you could specify that. So sorry if I'm being dense or ignorant, and sorry I'm not understanding. But maybe if you could specify that would be helpful. All right, wonderful to see Daniela Tokan checking in from Bochum, Germany, using Cubase 9. All right, Soren has received 1 gallon of cherry vanilla ice cream. We have Brian Sawyers, Brian the Bear, joining from Yuma, Arizona. All right, so DJ Mad says, is there a way to make the bus folder tracks behave as original bus channels, making them move in zones without taking the tracks that are in it? Yep, so if you want to, so we come over here, we could say, all right, so let's say if I have these particular tracks, just set these up to be outside of. Here, I'll just open up another project here quickly. So as you're working with, with the folders, if you want them to work the previous way, so right now I have, let's say, all of my drums here. All of my drums are in a folder. So if we hide our folder, now people like the convenience of selecting the folder and right-clicking and say enable group channel. It's a long-standing feature request. But if you wanted to work the opposite way, I could just come over here now, and we could right click, and I'm going to say, let's add a group channel to the selected tracks. Okay. Now, even though that group channel is in the folder, and we see it's selected here, my group channel 1, when we go to the visibility and to zones, I could take that group channel and still place it into different zones here. So it's the old way still works if you want it to be independent. A lot of people like the simplicity and the elegance of, having it unified, and we've, years of feature requests for that. Many, right? We had 4 requests for it the day before it was implemented on the live stream, but you could still just select the particular tracks and, create a group channel to the selected tracks and place that into the left, right, or center zone independently. All right, so we see Pablo says you can check that out. We have Stefan Larson joining from Sweden. Thanks for being online. All right, so we see from Soren, who just says Greg gets third-party instruments from Mixing Key called Captain Plugins. He has that behavior change. So let me know what behavior is different between 12 and 15 with those particular plugins. All right, Tim Weinheimer just says, thanks, Greg. Thanks, Steinberg. I don't know what you guys did, but my Arturia Spark Creative Drum Machine controller works in Cubase correctly now. Thanks for whatever you guys did. So maybe an updated remote control script. All right. So Brian DeBear has countered Uno Momento's pint of beer with a shot of Del Bac Del Rado, an Arizona whiskey born in the Sonora Desert. Okay, so we see TP means true peak level. All right, so let me go back to Soren's question from earlier. So fix problem found. It says Cubase 15 Pro, a couple VST instruments make sounds and creates true peak at +5. If I open up the same project in Cubase 12 Pro, the instruments don't make sounds, and it's at true peak -4. Is the VST entirely to blame for the happening? So it seems odd that the same projects, so I'm not sure if there's, maybe plugins that were used that are in 15 that don't open when you go back to 12, or if you're starting from a template and that template has routed to a group, and on a group is a dynamics processor. So let me know if that's kind of the case, if you have any dynamics processing on those particular channels. Let's say if you go to 12, if you have Black Valve may not work if you go back to earlier versions where it didn't exist yet. So maybe it's something like that. So we see from Rakoi Gani says, hi Greg, how do you solo external instruments? Because when I solo my external MIDI device, the input of the external instruments not producing any signals. Thanks. So I don't have an external instrument set up, but let us know exactly how the external instrument is connected. Is it, I don't think I have a quick way of adding a virtual, a hardware instrument as, and I don't really have the IO available. But let me know how the I/O is set up and what instrument it is, and if you could describe exactly kind of the how it's set up like how the routing is, or if you want to send like a screenshot to me at clubcubase@steinberg.de, I'd be happy to take a look. All right. All right, so a question. Hi, Greg. Can you demonstrate using retrolog 2 how to implement sidechain for audio in MIDI file? Thanks. Okay. So let's say I have my bass part here. All right, so let's add an instance of retrolog. All right. And I'm going to activate sidechain input, and we're going to send it from the bass. Okay. So when we do this, we want to have, we'll see our input here. All right, so let's see if I can get this right. So I'm going to turn down my oscillators here. And let's just check. I think we need to actually send it a MIDI message. All right, let me just send it to new instance without a preset loaded. Sorry. All right, so we want sidechain. We're going to send it to the bass again. So I think we need to have, I haven't done this in years, but let's think if we come over here, we need to have like a MIDI note that's on. And let me just turn off these oscillators and we'll adjust our input. So I think I'm missing like one button to make it. Let me just check. My send level is good. Alright, so we have. Alright, let me just. I think we need to have the. It's usually the trick is you have to have it kind of see if I could get this figured out for, let me just see, I'm sure I'm just kind of missing. Let me just see if I could. Usually I think you just kind of feed it in here. Make sure that the input is on, and usually you kind of hear it through the filters as soon as there's a MIDI note. Let me see if we split the MIDI note up. I'll see if I could get that dialed in for next time. Sorry about that, Alex. All right. Sven Isaacson says, is there a list of features that are new in Nuendo 15 that we haven't already paid for in Cubase Pro 15? Yes, there's lots of additional features. I mean, there's the analyzer track, more plugins. So there's, more like enhancements with the headphone match plugin. So there's a number of features that are still unique to Nuendo 15 that we don't see in Cubase 15. All right, so we see from John Barry says it's also a select track, disable, enable work, but not toggle for EQ, sends and inserts, bypass. I have to change the toggle presets to disable, enable, and they work. All right. Yeah, I know Steinberg's kind of working on some stuff with that. All right, so we see Pablo's figured out how to do the custom formats for those presets for a multi-export, that they each go into their own folder. All right, so FlyV is just saying, during the song's creation, what is the key to keep on time with the drums, etc.? So realize that, different people may need to hear different elements, like when they're recording. So, like bass players often don't, need to really lock into the kick drum. So if you're recording a bass part, the kick drum could be really critical to timing for, John Carroll, who's on the live streams periodically, is like an amazing performer, songwriter, just kind of a legendary guy. But when he was 19, he was in the Starland vocal band, of Afternoon Delight fame. That was like his post-high school job. Won a Grammy for Song of the Year, all that great stuff. And he was telling me how they went to different recording studios and and how critical the headphone mix was for them to capture their performance. And Phil Ramone, he remember him telling me that Phil Ramone was, dialed in like the best headphone mix. And because everyone was hearing exactly what they needed to hear, that their performance vocally was much better than other recordings. So a lot of engineers, what's really critical is it may not be the final mix, but, the keyboard player may need to hear a rhythmic pattern on a hi-hat in their headphones. Or you may just, when you're recording the keyboard part, be sure feel free to turn up different parts, not for the mix, but just so that the bass player can hear the kick, the guitar players can hear the snare. If they're playing on the 2 and 4, they probably need to hear the snare. A keyboard part may need to be locked in with a hi-hat, or a percussion part and they may need to lock in with hi-hats and a kick. So, when recording and tracking, always feel free to change the levels for the particular tracking scenario so that people can hear what they need to hear, and you see it all the time in live concerts where, if you watch bands playing at a club where they have a sound man, they're constantly giving a thumbs up, thumbs down. They'll point to a musician, say drummer, kick, they point to the kick. I need it up with a thumbs up or a thumbs down, because it makes a big performance in their particular performance. So that it makes a big difference, being able to hear exactly what you need to hear. And sometimes, just taking the click track. So let's say if we have our click track going here. So if I say, okay, I need this, to be double time for the musician, so that the click, they're playing eighth notes primarily, you could give them the click in eighth notes, and you could change different rhythmic patterns. So let's say you're doing like a 2 + 3 + 3 instead of 4 4. Changing the click pattern can also make a big difference to help people capture. All right, DJ Mad says, when you copy a plugin from one track to another and the sidechain is enabled, is there a way to have it copy the sidechain input as well? So currently when we drag a plugin to another track, the sidechain input isn't going to be enabled by default. That could often cause a lot of unintended consequences. If you want to, so let's say, okay, I want this plugin across, my kick and snare, the same plugin. I may not want the sidechain for the snare, may not be applicable. So we can't really assume that the same sidechaining. So there isn't a way to preserve the sidechaining. You would have to then reactivate the sidechaining when copied, because you're copying the plugin and not the routing to the plugin itself. All right, so we have Erzblop sending greetings from Switzerland using Cubase 15 Pro. All right. We have Alexander on, saying hello to everyone. Okay. So another question from DJ Mad. Is there a way we could delete plugins from the plugins manager when they are on the block list? Or we just need to do it one by one the regular way? I think you would need, if it's on the block list, let me see if I have any on the block list. Yeah, I don't have any, but I think that you would just need to do it one by one. I mean, you could, perhaps make I don't think making a new plugin collection would affect the block list. So I think that would be one by one. But there could be an update that makes the block list not as blocked if a plugin gets updated and the issues are resolved. All right, so Alexander is asking, is it possible to use expression maps in the pattern editor? So the pattern editor isn't really designed for expression maps, but if we have a particular, let's come over here, so let's say you know, if we start something in a pattern editor, so let's come over here, I'll just add an instrument track, let's make it Howling Sonic, and we'll get Iconic Sketch. Okay, so let's say we want to go to clarinet, all right. All right, so let me just do that one more time. I'm going to make sure I add it this time. So if we're starting off, let's say, as a pattern event, I could come over, so let's say, okay, we want to do, let's say, our clarinet again. Okay, so. All right, so now let's say if we have made a melodic pattern, so we'll come over here to our editor, and we'll choose a melodic pattern here. So there's no support for the expression map here, but if I wanted to kind of work with it, you know, we could drag this particular pattern to the main project window. Let's say we duplicate that a couple times. We will select all of these. I'm going to convert these to MIDI. And now that we have a MIDI event, we could come over here, and again, we'll, like, as we come over here, we'll just extract this to keep. And now we could do our expression maps here, but the expression maps are really intended more for the key editor, which I think kind of makes sense. But if we wanted to have the articulations kind of mapped out here, you know, we could say, okay, let's make it staccato for these particular notes. And let's say maybe these, we want it to be legato. So what the expression maps, I think, make more sense in the key editor as opposed to kind of the pattern editor. But if you needed to, you could take the pattern editor to a, you know, directly to a MIDI event and add the articulations there. All right, and two, can you explain more about expression maps? I bought some expression maps, so how can I import it? Does Cubase remid them? So if we have expression maps, we can now come over here to MIDI, and then we would go to your expression map setup. So all you'd have to do, you know, is to come over here. You could just say, okay, we want to, you know, add a map. We could, you know, import key switches. We could also just kind of come over and, you know, save particular presets. So if you wanted to, and what the expression map will allow you to do, the expression map will be tied to a particular instrument. So we can say, okay, when we come here, when we play particular articulation. So let's come down to, or we'll just go here to our instrument. Let me just open this up so we can see it a little better. So what the expression map is intended to do is like, okay, when we're playing now, we could have this be sustain. So, and if I trigger this note, I can now, or we could switch to be marcato. So, or if we want it to be legato, so if we're doing lines. And some of them would automatically respond. Some of them would automatically respond directly to, you know, moving like your modulation wheel. Could drive the dynamics. So you could just come over there and switch between different sounds. So if we go directly to, let's say, our cello sound, and we go to our articulations here. So now I could come over here to this particular part, and I could have it switch to be pizzicato. And if I was doing a fast run, so anytime that we go to a MIDI event, so let's say if we go to this cello line, we can now just come over here, and while it's playing, we'll make this full screen. And we bring up our expression maps, and we see the articulations. That when we come here, we see so I'll take it out of the loop. So say I want these to be trill. Pizzicato coming up here. So this way we could have different types of articulations that we could switch back and forth between. So when you have instruments that are set up with articulations and expression maps, we can now just come over to the cello. We can say these are the different articulations, and this is how we could switch between our different articulation maps. All right, let me see. Just have to respond to a quick text. Songwriter in Nashville. All right, excuse me 1 second. All right. Sorry about that. All right. So Pablo is just mentioning if you have Wavelab Pro that you could use the lesser versions by holding down the Alt or Option key when you start. Says wasn't as possible before, so I think you could do maybe Wavelab Artist and Pro together and Elements and Wavelab Cast together, but now they're all kind of unified, and you can do the same with Cubase as well. So we see from Flyv says, one other problem I keep having is my main template I use doesn't show up at times. Any way to fix this? So I haven't really run into that. I know sometimes when we're working with the hub and we come over, so let's say if we go to the hub, make sure that like the template is exposed, so you could just have like all of your recent projects or like your templates kind of hidden here. So make sure that your templates like the arrow is pointing down to the left, and maybe you could just continue to scroll down and see if all the templates are there. Maybe just hide your recent projects and see if that makes a difference for you. Okay. So we see from Steve Green, who asks, "Hi, I created a groove agent kit. I'm using just 5 pads. Created an event for the drums to play on, and playback groove agent is playing pads with no drums on them, and occasionally hits one with a drum on." Okay, so so just check to see, you know, if you've made kind of your own preset. So let's say we come over here, we'll have just like a blank groove agent instance. So let's say if we come over here to Alright, so say if I've made like a number of snares that I've now dragged across. So one, see if, I'll just unsell this, so. Alright, so see if when you click on the pads, if they are. Now, one of the things is to make sure also, if you want this to be, you know, this particular preset that you saved, you know, in this particular instance, this is looking in the original location for these particular drum samples. If I wanted to export the drum samples to an area that anytime I open up any project, I could still have access to these drum samples. So if I save my preset here, so we'll come over here, we'll save a preset, and we'll call it April 14th, 2026. Okay, so now when we save that preset, if I move the samples here from their original locations and I open up that particular preset, then I will be missing those drum sounds. And what you need to do is to right click, come over here, and we'll say export kit with samples. Now that we're here, we could, and you want to make sure that this is checked to export files. We could select, let's say my desktop. I'm going to make a new folder. All right, we'll call it April 14th, 2026. And now when I hit OK, that's going to copy all of those samples into that folder. So let's come over here to knowing that my desktop disappears every other day from Finder here. Okay, so now we come over here. Here's my April 14th, 2026 folder. And we can see that kit 1 with the samples is all just simply directly right there with all the samples. And that way, the samples can be independent and move with the project. So let me know if you copied the samples into the folder, into the project, and then dropped them in. And then in another project, you couldn't find them. Or if you exported the kit with the samples. So again, to get to the export kit with samples, try right-clicking and then export kit with samples. And then you could just kind of choose your particular folder here. And then when you open up that preset, it's always going to go to where those particular samples were saved. So you see, hey Greg, does a Cubase 15 Pro have something in it that can convert audio in MIDI notes? I've been seeing a couple DAWs with this feature. Says thanks for the 4.4 to 7.4 was easier than I had in my head. All right, so one of the things that, so you could do it for kind of monophonic sources. So if you have like drums that are set up, we could do that. So let's say, I'll just jump over here. So we could do it for monophonic sources. So it's not intended to do like pianos, you know, that are playing chords and guitar parts that are playing chords. And the programs that have it are pretty unreliable with the actual results. So if I wanted to take this bass part and we go into, let's say, our editor for the track, let's go to our inspector. We'll just double click here. We go to our very audio. So we do its analysis. And when we say choose function, we could now extract MIDI. And now we could convert like a monophonic source like saxophone, a vocal into MIDI like that. If we wanted to do this for drums, what we could do is let's come over here and just say, okay. We just, let's say if I wanted to do for like drum replacement, so what we could do is, let's say, for instance, I want to take I didn't like the kick drums here in this project. So what I could do is say, okay, I have an instance of Groove Agent, and I want like this particular kick drum to be triggered. So I'm going to go into my drum track. So I'm going to select that Groove Agent track. Let's go here to drums. And I'm going to go to the hit points. And Cubase kind of figure out the hit points. And what I want to do is just adjust the threshold so that only the kicks are really coming through and not the tracks are bleeding. And then we'll have this little create menu. So I could say, let's create MIDI notes. And let's say, since this is drums, I probably want it to be C1 for my kick. We retain our dynamic velocity. And now it's created a MIDI track that's going to trigger Groove Agent. So I'm going to mute the 3 kick tracks. And now we're just triggering the sample inside a Groove Agent. Or if we wanted to combine the sample to augment the drum recordings. So you could do it for kind of monophonic sources or for drums really easily, but not polyphonic sources. And I haven't seen a program that does that so accurately. So we see from Sven Isekson, says, love to see Steinberg publish a list of Nuendo specific features. There's a comparison between Nuendo 14 and 15, but that's not the same thing. Let me see if there is one sometimes. I could probably get a list together if you want to email me, Sven. Compare Nuendo and Cubase. So right here, so I just did, so if you go to steinberg.net/Nuendo/compare-editions, here you could see the comparison chart. So if you want to see for post-production features, so external Atmos renderer support, MXF video support, Aura 3D. So here's kind of the comparison that you want to see. So let me know if that's good for you, Sven. So once again, just to see that, if you get to steinberg.net/Nuendo/compare-editions. So I think that's kind of what you're looking for there. So we see Eduardo Satrian or Eduardo Asat Ryan, or it says, hi Greg, I'm curious, is there a way to have the tempo of a project while still maintaining the audio? It says the project grid needs to be reduced by half. All right, so let's say I have this as, I'm going to select all the files here. So I'm going to make sure that all of the files are in musical mode here. I'll just, all right, and I'm just going to, okay, so right now what I want to do is say, okay, we're playing this. All right, so we could set a project logical editor. And what I want to do is, let's say we want to have the tempo. So let's say our tempo now is 100 beats per minute. So we have tempo here. I'm going to activate the tempo track, and let's say our tempo is set to 100. So what I want to do is say we want to take our media type is equal to tempo, and we want to transform our tempo by, let's see if we'll say divide by 2. So now when I hit apply, so now we're at half tempo. So if we undo that, we're right back to where we were. So again, we just come here, say media type is equal to tempo. We're going to transform our tempo, and we're going to trim it, and we're going to say divide by 2, and now we're at 50 beats a minute. And we undo that. So let me know if that works for you. If that gets to, you say the project grid needs to be reduced by half. But let me know if that gets you kind of the end result, or if you just need to, so if you need it just for playback, or if you need, but I think it gets you to the same place at the end. Okay, so we see from Vince says, I also have a missing port pop-up for an old device I used to use. How do I stop this pop-up? So if you're getting if you're getting a missing MIDI port message, there's probably a track that is still like routed to that MIDI input or output port. So if you could find that particular track where the routing is off, or is set incorrectly, then you could just change that to a different MIDI port, save it, and then there's no reference to the MIDI port that doesn't exist. So you're kind of getting the message because there's a track that says, hey, I'm routed to this device, I'm not seeing this device, this can mess you up, heads up. So if you don't have that device, just look for the track that has that particular routing, and then you should be good to go, and just kind of change it to something that exists or to not connected. All right, Michael Teams wants everyone to whack the like button. All right, and Spacer 584 is on. Pablo has whacked the like button, so that's good to know. So we see from Tim K, it just says, that was interesting about tracking and monitor mixes, also true for mixing down keys, better if one dials up hi-hat in the cans too. Sorry to press, just fascinated. Usually for mixing down, it may not be as critical, because a lot of times you just want to be able to give the musicians, there's, for any of us that have recorded musicians, realize that, half of being a great tracking engineer is being a wonderful psychologist and making that person very comfortable, because especially someone's like first time in a big studio, they're incredibly nervous and there's a lot of anxiety, and they're just looking for a clock that doesn't exist in a big studio, because there's never a big clock in a studio, because you don't want to be figuring out how much it's costing per minute to be there. It's like Las Vegas. You don't see clocks in casinos in Las Vegas. So you want people to feel very comfortable all the time. So, I've seen Phil Ramone was like so great at making everyone just feel so comfortable and at ease in sessions. It was a real joy. I got to work a few sessions with him and just kind of watch the psychology of it. And you see it with great conductors as well. I had a friend that was like very nervous about a guitar solo that he was doing. He kept messing up. And then I made him stand on one foot while he was doing the guitar solo. The part of the brain that was kind of triggering the anxiety then switched to not falling over and, landing and falling on the floor during the take. And he wasn't thinking about the guitar part, and he played like the most amazing solo. but he doesn't remember it. But we just got his brain kind of out of the, I'm going to screw you up and overthink things. So, but it's more, I think, for tracking and then as opposed to mixing down. So. Okay, so we see says Suop just says got the retrolog sidechain to work by switching from default post fader to pre-fader send, but volume is weak despite input on max and volume at 1 dBs. All right, so let's try it again here. Let's take this bass part and see if we feed it in. So let's try one more time, see if I get that to work. Let me add the instrument track. Turn off the oscillator. Try guitar instead, see if that makes. Yeah, so even if we do. I'll play around with it, see if I get dialed in for Friday's live stream. Sorry about that. All right, so we see from DaVinci Girls, is it possible in the live streams not to use so much piano roll and editor? Is it possible to use a Dorco editor? So I'll try to use more of the score editor. So sorry about that. I'll try to see if I could incorporate that. So we see from Sven Isaacson, says any word on still missing PDF manual for VST Live 3. So I haven't heard, but I'll see if I could inquire about it and see if I get a response, and get a response when I had asked before. All right. So we have a question. How can I have automation of group volume move as well when moving or nudging all tracks, all folders, all groups, couple bars forward and backwards? Okay, so I'll just do it with the folder track group first. Okay, so let's say if I have automation here, so let's say we're going along, and I want to automate my group folder. So let's come over here. All right, so let's say we have that automation of a group volume. So if I move the group here, we should see, looks like, make sure that automation follows events is enabled. All right, so let's see if I select that and move. Looks like that stays. And let me just make sure this isn't locked. Yeah, it looks like the automation isn't moving with the event because there is no event there. Let's see if we... So you may have to select the automation separately. So let's say if we do this, and then we move the event. So I guess because this isn't a particular event, so you may have to select the automation and move it manually. I'll make sure to mention that so that maybe selecting that particular event would make a difference there. Okay, hang on. All right, so I just saw your email from Alex, so thanks for that, and I'll see if I can get dialed in for Friday's live stream. All right, so we see from Fly-V just says, last issue I've been having is the mix console not opening in a separate window. When I click the arrow, it opens, but I can't see it. So check to see if it's maybe off screen. So sometimes, let's say if we go to our mix console and we open up kind of our arrow here, make sure that it's not like tucked away off screen, something like that. It could be like, maybe behind a window. So maybe if you go to your Windows menu, say, okay, here's my mix console is there. So maybe it's behind another window, and then maybe you could grab a corner. So maybe it got kind of tucked behind another window. See, Martin Sheenan says best way to get Stream Deck working on multiple units. Soon use second. Everything stops working. I don't have my other Stream Deck. My son has it upstairs for his flight simulator. So I have the one that's kind of working, but it looks like, if you open up like the Stream Deck software, I think I've had two functioning at once. So you can see I have the CC1, then I have an XL and an XL2. So when I come over here, it seems like they coexist. I could get multiple Stream Decks for Friday's live stream. But let me know if you are utilizing, Martin, if you could let me know if you're utilizing the Stream Decks as a remote control or if you're just triggering key commands with it. But here it's like, I have 3 different Stream Deck devices. I'm not sure. I think that they would all coexist and work concurrently, but I don't have my 2 Stream Deck units in my studio, just the one for the Yamaha CC1. But I'll have multiple Stream Decks open on Friday if you want to send me a brain cramp email reminder, but I'll make a note to myself when I do the index. Okay, so we see all right, so you see from Tim K says, thank you, Greg. Gosh, I could listen to your stories all day. I'm sure my wife is tired of them. All right, my son too. All right, so we see from Vada Martinyuk says that's the issue I always have when moving group or folder automation. So yeah, I mean the folder itself is not an event, so it's kind of a holder of events, but I think it can make sense when you move a folder with group that it move the automation inside of it. All right, so we see from Bratman Studio, says, Greg, back in the day to make rhythmic keyboard parts, we used to sidechain into a gate triggered by some drums, a kick, and we got very tight keyboard rhythms. Is that still done much? Yeah, and let's see if we can get it set up here. All right, so let's say if we have kind of maybe a Rhodes part here. And let's come over here to, let's say, our beat agent. And let's say, let me just turn that down to annoyingly loud. Sorry. All right, so let's say we want like this hi-hat. All right, so let's say I want to take that hi-hat. I'm going to route it out to its own pad here. Okay, so let's open up, let's say on this Rode sound. And let's open up a gate. And let's set our sidechain input to, let's say, our hi-hat out. so let's come over here and send that to the gate. And let's go ahead and we could just kind of set and you could kind of play with the threshold a little bit. But yeah, so you could just kind of set up the and kind of find a threshold for that. So. But yeah, it's still not having the best sidechaining today, but yeah, so you can still use that and kind of sidechain gates to get kind of rhythmic pulses in synth parts. All right, so we see, can you please show extreme ducking sidechain effect with one band only and a multi-band compressor? Okay. Okay, so let's see if we have kind of a sidechain here. Let's all right, so let's say we have like this scenario going on. Okay, so we want this synth part. So let's put a multi-band compressor. All right, and we will come over here. Let me see if there's sidechain in here. Thought there was. Sometimes it's on. Thought we could sidechain. All right, I'll just set it up with the built-in compressor. So now when we come here, turn that on. So that's with the normal compressor. Let me just see, looking at the, sometimes there's like extended controls. Yeah, I'm not seeing the sidechain on individual bands. I know we could do it in some of the other multi ones, but it doesn't look like it's in the multi-band. I would think it's in there. Sometimes the sidechaining is revealed, but maybe it doesn't have sidechaining on that, but the dynamic EQ does. Let me try. It's an envelope shaper. Let me try the compressor. Okay. Here we could do our sidechaining. Sorry about that. Okay, so now we have the sidechain area here. So we could turn on our sidechain. Say we want this coming from the kick. I'll turn off the other compressor. So that way only particular frequencies are affected. So let's say if I wanted to go to my high mids, we'll hear more of the low frequencies. Maintain. And here we hear more of the high frequencies, but the low frequencies are sidechained down. Sorry about that. All right. All right. Okay. Okay, so we see how does OmniVocal works with MIDI. All right, so let me just open up. Okay, so when you have MIDI notes in the MIDI editor, you can come over all right, so say we want to take this example here. So I'm going to have just like a piano part in etude. So if we want to see that in score editor, we could see that, but let's come over to but what you do is you just have MIDI notes, and then when you come over here, you go to text and just type in the text for the lyrics that you wanted to sing. So when we come over here, so as you just kind of select the notes here, you could type in the lyrics. And and then OmniVocal will sing it for you.
To my core, I don't have to worry.
And if you want this to be a female singer,
Where you are, right here in the center of my
and then we could adjust the formants.
I know all your scars and the story, from your head down to the soles of your feet.
So it's a great little plugin that's included. All right, Beverly Beatty asked Greg, the ducking you're showing with Sidechain, how would you keep the ducking sound on the bass if the kick is not there in the track to keep the bass Sidechain groove uninterrupted? All right, so if you want to go back, so if we just kind of want the effect of the sidechain without hearing the sidechain source, what we could do is come over here. So let's say we now have our sidechain. Let's say if we activate this, and we want kind of the sidechain to affect the kick. So let's say as we play here, okay, so let me open up this channel and I'll just do it, let's say. So if I didn't want to hear that particular source, what I could do is just take this track, and in routing, I could just send it to no bus. And as we do that, so we don't hear the sidechain source, but we actually hear the result of the sidechain source. So again, take the sidechain source, instead of sending it out to the stereo output, send it to no bus. And every time you see the kick come in, you see the sidechain source still having an impact on the bass. So let me know if that's kind of what you want to do, Beverly, with that. All right, so we see Rick at Bratman Studios got the new TD27, and it's much better than the TD15. So for his Roland electronic drum set. All right, so let's get to some questions that were mailed in. Get to some of those. All right, so we had a question. How do you customize your plugin into user selected categories? Okay. So when we want to come over here, what we could do is just, so let's look at our studio menu and we go to VST Plugin Manager. All right, so when we look at this, we have all of our VST effects. We have VST modulators. We're going to have and VST instrument categories here. Now, if let's say you bought a suite of plugins and you're only using 2 of the plugins out of 20, then you don't want to see the other 18. Now, when you look at our plugins, there's 2 default ways to organize your plugins. So we could organize when we go to this little drop-down menu, and again, this is in the studio menu to our VST plugin manager. And when we come right here, we could also organize by vendor. So we can say, okay, here's Steinberg, Voxengo, Yamaha, Air Music Technology. So you could come over here and sort by vendors or sort by category. So this would be analyzer, delays, distortion. So within the VST3 specification, you could have all of these categories defined so that they can go directly in. Now, if we want to customize our own, what we could do is click on the little plus sign. Now we can start with, I could copy the current collection. So we could do that, and we'll say, okay, this is April 14th, 2026, and we hit OK. And now that I have my own plugin collection, I can say, oh, I really don't want to see the de-esser here. So what I could do is just delete that. Or I want the expander to be the very first plugin that I see in this particular list. I don't believe in reverb when I mix, so I can come over here and delete that whole folder. If we have plugins under other, I could say, okay, I want to create a new folder, and we'll say other amp. And I want to come over here and I say, okay, let's just grab that particular plugin, and we could drop them into these particular categories. So you could have subfolders within folders. You can create folders. You could have all of your plugins just set up in the order that you want. And when we do this, we could, and you don't really modify like the default settings. So you could copy the default and then modify that, but the default will always kind of include all of your plugins. So we could do this independently for your VST effects, for your VST instruments, for your VST modulators, and organize your plugins pretty much like how you want to see different elements, so that when you're if whatever makes sense for your personal organization, so you could find all of the plugins or hide plugins that you don't want to see, we can come right over here and use the VST plugin manager, and that's going to be carried over in your profile manager as well, so that when you go to a new system, new computer, this could automatically be carried over. And if you want to go back, now one thing to be aware of, let's say we're in our April 14th, I install a new plugin. That new plugin isn't automatically going to be added into a custom plugin collection. So one of the tricks that you could do is come over here and say, if I have this particular plugin collection, I could say, and let's say I forgot the name of the plugin I just installed. We could say hide plugins that are not in the active collection. So I could say, oh, the de-esser plugin, that's the one I just installed, so I want to put that into my dynamics folder. And I could come over here and see which particular plugins that that are not in the active collection. So I say, okay, I want to come over here to, I can see my reverb plugins. And then if I just come over here, so, when you add a new plugin, if you're not seeing it in the list, like, where is it? You can just simply rescan the plugin folder, and go to this little drop-down menu, and you could say, hide the plugins that are in the active collection, and this will reveal all the plugins that aren't in this collection, and then you can drag and drop them over directly into your system, into your new plugin collection, so that you could organize everything as you see fit. All right. Let's go to another question that was mailed in. Okay, so a question mailed in. How do you pre-set up the grid or quantize settings to have a dragged-in sample auto-align with the grid? Okay, so let's do a new project here. Okay, so let's say I want to, like, I think it's like copying maybe like a kick sample and having it on the grid. So let's come over here, say, okay, let's find a kick. Let me find just a one shot. All right, so let's say I want to, so now once I have my snap on here, so let's say you can hit the letter J. So now if I was just copying this over, let me just see if I can find something that's shorter. All right, so so if my snap isn't on, when I drag a sample from our timeline over, it will automatically be placed wherever I drag it to. If snap is on here, and let's say I have my snap set to beat, now when I drag over a kick sample, it's only going to allow me to place it directly on a beat. So let's say I want this on measure 2, beat 1, and I want to make a copy of that and move it, let's say, to beat 3. So now when we play this, you can just listen to, we'll have on our kick on beats 2 and 3. So let's say if I want this on, I'm going to hold down Alt or Option again, move, and now we could say, oh no, 1, 3, 4. Now if these samples don't really line up, and a lot of people will come over now and say, okay, I want to duplicate these samples. So I'm going to select those particular samples, and now when I move it, it's not really on the grid. The first one is. All right, so if we want to be able to copy or duplicate on a grid, so what happened is when we duplicate, it's going to take this particular range and it's going to place it right after, but we see that this kick isn't on the downbeat. So because this sample isn't extending all the way to the end of the beat, what we could do now is use the range tool, and we could select the particular range. And now when I duplicate, hit Control or Command plus D, now we duplicate that range. So we're duplicating that measure, which includes all the events in it. So when we play, so, and then that way we duplicate the range. That range is one measure. So we duplicate that measure, and that measure contains those 3 events. Those 3 events don't add up in length exactly to one measure, but they're going to keep their relative positions within the particular range. All right, see if we have some more live questions, and that will go on. All right, so we see Musictron. This says, how do you join the Discord? So I think Jazzy just posted a link. So we see from Soren, says this question with the different signal levels between different versions. Says Greg, no dynamics in the project. It's just in Cubase 12, the VST instruments is correctly not sounding internal don't play sounds when closed is on. Cubase 15, the internal setting is play sounds when closed. Yeah, if you want to send me like a video, Soren, to clubcubase@steinberg.de, I'd be happy to kind of take a look at it if you wanted to. I know you've been great at doing videos to kind of highlight and show problems. If I can see the video, that might be helpful for me. Also check just to make sure, like if you go to your project setup, like Shift+S, make sure like your project pan law isn't set up differently there. You know, and I assume that you're just opening up the project and not opening it from inside of a template. Let me know if you're opening it in a template, or importing the tracks, or you're just opening up the same project, which is what I assume you're doing. Okay, so let's go back to next question that was mailed in. All right, so questions on Wavelab Go. So let me open up Wavelab Go. So Wavelab Go, if you're not familiar with it, is kind of a cut down version of Wavelab. And so, and you get that free with your license of 15, of Cubase 15 or Nuendo 15 with the 15.02 update. You'll find it in your Steinberg download assistant. Okay, so we'll start Wavelab Go. All right, so we see, does Wavelab Go have the settings on the rainbow display of the waveform? Is grayed out? Is that is it possible to see those particular settings? All right, so we just come over to all right, so when you look at the waveform, we can come over here and we can see that we'll have, like, you know, some waveform settings, and we'll have settings for different, like for the spectrogram, for wavelet display. But I think that those settings here are just not available in the Wavelab Go. I kind of looked through the documentation, but some of the other things will have settings. But just to kind of give you an idea, if I open up another file, it's often going to be, you can think of sometimes like brighter frequencies. It could be more set up for, like, could be brighter in color, like for sibilance. I'll show you kind of an example with sibilance. Just for all right, so let's say if we open up this file for sibilance, so I don't believe that the rainbow is going to allow you to do the settings, but when we listen to this particular file, if we're doing our editing,
in language, infinitely many words can be written with a small set of letters.
where you have the sibilance frequencies, those are going to be kind of very bright yellow.
From just a few digits, with the help of the symbol 0, the principle of position, and the concept of base. In language,
so that will kind of give you a sense. So generally, you could think like the brighter the frequencies, those could be more high frequencies. But it looks like in the Go version, I don't think yet you're going to have the ability to change the colors, but, you know, just so you have an idea what the colors kind of represent. All right, so next question we had was how to retrigger edits in Wavelab Go. So if you do an edit in Wavelab from Cubase and then go to Wavelab Go to have the changes from the edit carry over, So let's say if I'm in Cubase here, let me just jump over to this project. Okay, so let's say I'm doing editing here on this project. So let's say we're here. All right, so now we have this option to come over here to edit in Wavelab. And once we do that, we could launch Wavelab. So let's say if we do an edit here, take this out. So I don't think that there's going to be a way to like the full Wavelab. Just make sure I'm in Wavelab Go. So the full Wavelabs, you can now take this and have this particular edit restored back into Cubase. And I think that the intention when we do this now is just to say, okay, I want to go to my extension, and when we say Wavelab, that we double click and that we do that process through the ARA extension as opposed to doing, so now if I come over here and let's say I delete that, and if we make that extension, so let's say as we play this part of the file, we'll hear a channel basically drop out. So as soon as I make this particular extension permanent, then that would automatically re-trigger the update. So we could think of the old way as kind of a precursor, like a kind of a previous technique to get what we're doing with ARA. And since the Wavelab Go works with the ARA, then you don't necessarily need to have that functionality because you have the two-way communications with ARA. All right, the third question was if we set up the extension for ARA for Wavelab Go at the event level, how can we undo it? So let's take a quick look. So if we go here and let me just set, I think we can set our extension. Let me see if it's, I'll move this up. Okay, so let's say I go to extension, and let's say we go to Wavelab. All right, so let's say now if we're in a different file, we'll be in our sample editor. Come here, so let me just see if we could just choose no extension. And now when we double click, you're right back into the wave editor. So if you select the extension from the info line for the particular event, then you could select the event again, go to the extension, and choose no extension. All right, let me jump back, see if we have some more live questions. Okay. So we see Soren says he'll send a video. Says we'll check the panel log. It says yes, opening same project. So it's an interesting problem. Yeah. Be happy to take a look at the video for you. All right, Spacer584 asks, hi Greg, I have a project. When I use a few VSTI and audio, nothing special. When I save project, no issue. But when I close it using file close, then unload is not finished. It freezes. So often when we run into situations like that, it could be, a particular plugin that doesn't release the memory that it's using for a particular project. So often when a plugin is like, okay, I'm using this much memory, and you try to close it out and the plugin says I'm still using this much memory, that kind of causes the situation. So what you're describing often happens when third-party VST plugins are kind of causing issues and not releasing memory. Some people will close all of the projects before quitting Cubase and find that can help, release the memory usage of some plugins. But I think you're going to find it due to a plugin that's kind of misbehaving with its memory management. All right, so we see it's every time on a different place. No clue what's causing it. Maybe just remove one track, then again, etc. to get it. Okay, so we see from Edgener, is there a utility to batch convert old .mpr files to new .cpr files? So the two file formats are interchangeable. So like if I come over here in Cubase, I don't need to do a conversion. What I could do is just come over and we'll say, okay, I want to X, when I go to open a project. So let's say if I come over here to projects, let's find, I could freely open up a .cpr or a .npr file. I think I have a NPR of this. My NPR file. So I could freely just open that up. So there's no conversion that's needed. You could just open up and like .npr files in Cubase and .cpr files in Nuendo. So if you just literally renamed a file format to .npr from .cpr or .cpr to .npr, it wouldn't make any difference. So the file format really is the same between the two. All right, so we have Joe from South Africa in Cape Town. Says I work for Joe Records Global and Atlantic Studios as a sound engineer. Thanks for joining us on the live stream today. All right, we see Gareth is going to bed, so thanks for joining us, Gareth. All right, we have Recyclop joining from Finland. Right, Randy Lee Music is back. All right, see a question redacted from Contra's Power. All right. We see Jazz, you just mentioned make sure you have less than 200 characters when asking. All right, so I think we have one more question that was mailed in. Could you please do the example again of the ducking delay? You did this topic in the last Cubase live stream, but there's something I didn't quite pick up in the nanosecond. In a nanosecond, my results don't sound the same as what you demonstrated. All right, so let's see. Maybe I have a project still stored. All right, so let's say we have a delay here.
Do you recall the day we first met?
All right, so let's make it like in.
Long time ago.
All right, so if we wanted to not have the delay so obvious going on all the time,
You looked my way and your heart shone through.
so what I did is you could duplicate the track, and I'm going to send this track's output. I'm going to activate the sidechain input here, and we're going to take this track and use that as our sidechain input. So our duplicated track, we're going to feed into the sidechain input, and I'm going to route this to no bus. So now when we play,
Do you recall the day we first met? That was a long, long time ago.
and now let's adjust kind of our
It was 7th grade and
send amount.
parking lot, waiting on our yellow coach to ferry us home. You looked my way.
So take the second track, send that to no bus, and then feed that as the sidechain input. All right, I think I may have gotten a couple of questions during the live stream for okay, let's see. We could okay, we did that one. Okay, so we see a question. Are there pattern sequencer factory presets? I like the templates that Cubase has that include pattern sequencer. They're very helpful. Songwriters, I would like to experiment with more factory presets for the pattern sequencer. All right, so let's take a look. Let's say we want to, so I'm not sure if there's melodic ones, but let's take a look. Let's say we add, let's say a retrolog. So I think if we come over, let's say, all right, let me just make it into a pattern event. Okay, so I know that when we go to drums, so let me add a drum track here. Then I think if we come over, let's go to our media bay, let's go to presets, and I think that we'll see pattern editor. So let's say, okay, I want my bass. So I think if we just come over, so now that the pattern editor is open, I can so again, to get here, just go to presets, and then you'll see patterns. So you'll have beat designer patterns. So I could come right over here and say, now I want and then if we wanted to come over and start doing variations, so say I want to take this, let's take So we could now just kind of come over here and let's get the rate. So you could just, again, just kind of drag these over and they will load up kind of built-in instruments and different drum patterns. So you could have all sorts of fun with different presets directly there for patterns or for melodic patterns or drum patterns. All right, so we had a question. I'm trying to understand the new plugin Ultra Shaper. It sounds amazing on everything. Wow, that's an amazing plugin it is. Is it based on some other vintage gear? I'm trying to understand more about it and what it does under the hood. You know, so one of the things that, you know, when we use the Ultra Shaper plugin on, let's just put it on like a project here. So, you know, the concept is that a lot of times when you do compression, that it's going to, you know, do compression on and affect the dynamics, you know, like the dynamic level, the volume of tracks, and you have to kind of compensate for that all the time. So the concept is that, you know, you could have the effects of that without, you know, inducing gain changes. So we'll just give you an idea. So let me just revert this. All right, so let's say we want to put the Ultra Shaper. Yeah, and if you haven't played around with this, is one of the new plugins in 15. So let's say we want to take our drums here. I'll just mute the bass for now. All right, so now we go to, let's say our inserts here, and we'll say, okay, let's get to our dynamics. So you kind of get the effects of all of the compression without really altering kind of the dynamic levels. So if you, and you get like a, you know, so let's say you want to do, you know, dense drums here. So you don't always have to worry about doing different kind of gain compensation, that the gain is kind of taken care of and you get the sound of all of the compression. So sometimes when you apply compression and you make up the gain, you do too much, and then but with this plugin, it kind of automatically, I don't know of, you know, it automatically kind of handles that, so it's a non-issue, kind of mitigates that issue. I don't know of a hardware unit. I'm not sure if there's hardware units that really do this. But sometimes it's not, you know, don't worry if it's modeling this compressor or not, or if it looks like a particular compressor, like as you figured out that, you know, you get great results with the Ultra Shaper. All right, let's jump back. All right, so some more questions. Let me find my spot. All right, so we see, all right, let me just make sure I'm not missing other questions. All right, so we see from Bratman Studio, sorry if I missed your question, it says on Groove Agent, there are two roll-in types, Groove Agent Factory and User. Why? So I'm not sure if, let's look at mine. So we'll come over here. So on mine, I just have the Roland TD series. So this is factory. If you see one that says Roland TD user, do you think that maybe you had right-clicked on some settings and changed some trigger notes for different pads? So I think if we had changed these and saved it as a preset, so let's come over here, that, you know, it might do that, but from the factory, we only see, you know, these kits. So there isn't a Roland TD user that is a factory preset. So maybe it is a preset that you made or that you modified and saved under that name. Sorry if I missed your question, Rick. All right. All right, we see Uno Mementos turning in for the night. All right, we see Graham Witcher checking in from Oxford. Great to see you on. All right, Gerald asks, sometimes when loading drums in Groove Agent 6, I get a warning. Loading will override the global player pad settings. What is this about? All right, so let me see if we go to like a full instance of Groove Agent. So I think it's going to be... All right, so let me come over here, just... All right, and let me see if I can trigger that message. So if you could let me know if there's like two particular kits that you're running into it with it. So, you know, let's say if we go to our player pad settings, so I'm not sure if when you load that up, if you've modified any of the like notes for that trigger the particular patterns, or if you have patterns like user patterns that you've made here as well. If these are kind of being overwritten, if you're loading in a different one. So maybe if you've made like your own patterns here, so let's say let's see if I make a pattern. All right, and now let's say if I come over here, all right, so let's say if we come here to pattern again, let me try different. completely different players. Let's say we get a feature past perfect. So let me know if there's two particular kits, like you're starting on one kit and going to another one, but maybe it's just overloading either like your pattern assignments, if you've customized those, or if you've made a custom pattern here, and maybe it's just giving you a warning that it could be overwriting those. All right, Sven Isaacson says, if I save an MPC, maybe an NPR project in Nuendo with Nuendo specific feature, open it in Cubase, save it, and reopen it in Nuendo, will the Nuendo specific feature survive that round trip? Let's give it a shot. Okay, so let's... Okay. And let me process. All right, so I'm going to process this with the Nuendo specific. And let me just do and in our master fader, let's put our headphone match plugin. Okay, so let's save this. Okay, let's jump over to Cubase. Okay, so we'll do that. Now let me add an instrument here. let's say retrolog. Right, so now okay, now we'll go back to new window, open up. All right, so we see our retrolog with its pattern. All right, let's come over here to our main output and see if our headphone match plugin is preserved. And we had that for the AKG 240. So yeah, looks like everything is preserved. It's just you may get a warning message in Cubase, but it looks like all the Nuendo specific features. Let's come over here to our direct offline processing. So we should see the tonal match, which is unique to Nuendo, and the ping pong delay, which is in both. So it looks like everything is preserved with the round trip. See, Bratman Studio says, thought Greg was quiet for a long time and tried to reload the page, and then Greg was showing stuff. So I'll have to add more cowbell in my next drum beat that I make for Beverly. All right. Sorry about that. And I need to show more score editor. All right, Gerald's second question is, when I drag a pattern into the project and play it, I get the red warning MIDI note, triggers a player and a kit pad. Can you go into more about what that is and what to do? Okay, so let me just jump over to Cubase. I think maybe what you're running into could be, let's say if we come over here. All right, so let's say, Groove Agent, we have notes that can trigger sounds. So, that could trigger sounds. So when we come over here, we can now, so let me just, so if we wanted this to, so we could play particular sounds, and then we have MIDI notes that will trigger players. So when I come over here, we can maybe, I'll just load up a different preset here. So let's say now when I play this note is triggering a pattern. So these notes are triggering a pattern. This pattern is, so when we come, I'll just continue to play this, and we switch to our kit. We can see the different notes that are being played right there. So now sometimes these notes can overlap. So if you have samples that, or a pattern, so a note that maybe is intended for kick drum at C1 may, let's say, if you come over here, you notice that we have B0, the note right below it is actually triggering patterns. So you may have a pattern that, or a MIDI sequence that is triggering a pattern as opposed to just notes. Now, what you could do to kind of, mitigate this is when you come over, let's say, I think if we go to the kit here, or maybe the player, we'll see this little Omni. Where's it going to be? I think it's, try clicking like right here. And then you could set this, try, coming over here and set this to like, where you could have different MIDI port settings. So you have port 1 and an Omni port or port 2. And then the notes that trigger the samples will be on one port, and the notes that trigger the patterns may be on another port. So just to the right of the follow transport, click right there. It's a very subtle icon. And try to put those onto different ports, Gerald, and that may kind of solve your problem for you. So you see from Rick, it says that I don't have the TD user. It says I don't know, wasn't there. My TD15, my new TD7 USB may have added, crazy maybe. There's a chance that Roland may have added like their own mappings for Groove Agent 6. I'm not sure. All right, so we see from FlyV says I'm getting a start error. Cubase is failing on opening. It says application is terminated. What do I do? So I would try to start it in safe mode. So I think you're on Windows, but you hold down, like as you start, I'll do this on 14. Just double click and hold down Alt Control Shift or Command Option Shift right after you click on the program to start it. So I'm going to click, then hold down and keep them held down. And then you could come over here and try to run it in a safe mode. So see if you disable the program preferences. Sometimes, preferences could get corrupted. So see if you disable the program preferences if it boots up. And see if that does a trick for you. You could also delete the program preferences if you wanted to, but I would try to disable first and see if that makes a difference for you. So it's like, think of it like starting in a safe mode. So you could start in a safe mode, and you could also bypass, within that window, you have a choice to bypass third-party plugins as well. So maybe a third-party plugin could be causing it to act up and misbehave. All right, so we see, hello, Greg, grateful to your advice and help. After upgrading Nuendo, I started sensing latency in the click sound as well as the MIDI recording is happening sooner to the grid. Advise me. So check to make sure, one of the things that you could do, just out of curiosity, is just to come over and try to see what happens. Like, let's say I'll do a new project here. All right, so let's say I have my click track here for 9 bars. Okay. So let's say we listen to it. I have my click on. So one thing you could check is if you go to your edit menu, or project menu rather, to signature track and choose to render audio click between locators. So now when we come here, we could see the audio click, and I'm going to play that click and play it with our click as well. So see if that is off to you. So if you're doing like an audio click, so let's see if I come here, and you should hear a difference when you invert phase. But let me know if that sounds off when you render the click, you know, and let me know what you find there. You know, sometimes it's hard to actually determine if the click is early. But try rendering the click and play it against the click and see, you know, so right now we have both the click, the real-time click, and the audio click at the same time. So there's our real-time click, and now coupled with the audio click. And tell me if those are aligned for you. And that would be a good test. All right, so we see Soren has sent the video. Thank you for doing it. I saw the email pop in. All right. Okay. See Rick from Bratman Studio giving kudos to Jazz Dude for all his work. All right, so we see from Steve Green, I want to use a simple guitar event for a chord track. There's quite a few arpeggios. Is there a way of simplifying what chords are being picked up, the basic notes, etc.? So I think usually even like, you know, like a normal guitar part, let's see, I may have one that we could access here. We just find, I think, in the Pro Instruments bundle. You find something. Find some arpeggios. All right, so let's say I drop that in. So it's pretty much arpeggios. So I'm going to take that and let's come over to our chord track and we'll say create chord events. So we'll let it just continue on here. So let's come over here, and that's kind of arpeggio based. So we'll see if that's. See if we change his chords here. It's gonna be the same chord. Let's say even we take this part here, so drag it down, do its analysis of it. So it looks like it's, you know, picking up for our chord detection pretty well. So even here. So it seems like that's pretty picking up different ones, different arpeggiators, different guitar styles. All right. All right, so you see Bratman Studio says, Greg, my friend, back in the day, having 15 to 25 millisecond delay in a vocal like David Bowie used was a cool sound. By adding a second track and moving its time, would you do the same effect, shift track? I mean, you could, but it's, you know, it's probably not so necessary. So let's say if we jump over here, let's put in some vocals.
Blow like seasons, yes, I love. I'm the one that needed clothes. Love me. I'm the one that needed clothes.
Okay, so let's say we have like this.
I'm the one that needed closure.
So I think, you know, you could do it that way, but it's probably just as fast to put a delay on it. So let's say if we duplicate that track and we want to move this ever so slightly, so I'll just move the start position here. So
I'm the one that needed closure.
we could move it a little more.
I'm the one who needed change. Couldn't leave this all unanswered.
And if we have our timeline set to seconds, we could say, okay, I just want this one to start 25 milliseconds later. So
I'm the one that needed closure. I'm the one who needed change.
So you could do it like that, or, you know, if you want to just come up here and let's put a delay on it. So let's go to a studio delay. And maybe we want one single delay, no repetition. Let's switch this to 25.
I'm the one that needed closure. I'm the one who needed change.
Let's just add a little more.
Couldn't leave this all unanswered.
So you could, let me put it on the correct one this time. Sorry about that.
I'm the one that needed closure. I'm the one who needed change.
So you could just kind of do,
Couldn't leave this all
that's
unanswered.
25 milliseconds. Let's do 15.
Couldn't do it all this pain. I'm the one that needed closure. I'm the one who needed change. Couldn't leave this all unanswered.
And then if you want it only on specific frequency ranges, so if you want it like a filtered.
I'm the one that needed closure.
So you could do it just as easily, I think, using a plug-in if you wanted to. So. All right, so Jazz Dudes post a link to some free Roland VST instruments. Yeah, and check out Roland Cloud, is quite good as well. I like a lot of the instruments in there. All right, so we see comment from Beverly Beatty, just says, thanks, Greg. Didn't think of the region. That's a cool way to nudge the WAV file backwards quickly to double, thicken your Vox up, bringing up the track and dragging it. That's way quicker. Well, if you get paid by the hour, just dragging it randomly is good. So, all right, so I think we might be at the end of questions. We'll see if there's other questions that pop in. We'll give it our minute or so. Thanks for all the great questions from everyone. Hope that everyone's learned a new tip or trick. And if you have, make sure that you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We usually do these live streams on Tuesdays and Fridays starting at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So. See if there's other questions. And again, we're here just to answer questions you have on any of your Steinberg products. All right, so we have Witty Music joining from Nashville. Thanks for being on the live stream with us. Thank you for the kind words, Gerald. Always means a lot. All right, just give it another 30 seconds or so. Thanks to everyone for wonderful questions and being such a great community. All right, so we have Samotnuf from Hanover, Germany. I got to go there once for a C-Bit show like 30-some years ago. All right. All right, so it looks like we are out of questions. I want to thank everyone for all the great questions and hope that everyone's learned some new tips. And if you, we'll be back on Friday starting at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. Look forward to seeing everyone back then. And if you have questions that you want to send in advance, you can send them to clubcubase@steinberg.de. I want to thank everyone for being part of such a wonderful community, and everyone please stay safe and healthy, and we'll be back on Friday. Goodbye.